Hello and welcome to TALRadio. At TAL, we connect those who are in need to those who are willing to give. And giving is not an easy task. My lovely audience, my lovely listeners, you are watching and listening to a beautiful series on self coaching. And it's my honor today, in this lovely 2025, to welcome Andrew Tallents once again on TAL Radio. Andrew is a self coaching expert and he has helped leaders across the globe to reach their full potential and to really know what they are capable of. Andrew, welcome to TAL Radio and a very happy new year to you.
Thanks, Sandy. Happy New Year to all the listeners.
And I think there's a backstory to this beautiful episode that we are just kicking off today because, as everybody can see, he's got little things on his head, bandages. And would you like to say something about it, Andrew?
Yeah, just to say we're talking about self-coaching and self-leadership. And I went to see the doctor a year ago just to check myself out, which is unusual for a lot of people to do that, and found a couple of growths on my head that needed removing. So that was all done a couple of days ago, all under local anesthetic. And I'm pleased to say it's all gone very well. So no problems. But I was keen to do this podcast with you today, Sandy.
Lovely. Thank you so much. It's my honor, really. Looking at you, I think you're really an inspiration, Andrew. Believe me, you are. All right, so let's move on with the self coaching series. And today we would be talking a lot about behavior. First of all, there's so much to learn from your behavior today. But let's talk about people in journal and let's talk about what is behavior assessment in journal and why is it so important in personal development?
A great question. So if you think about the way that we all behave each day, every day with family and work, it's usually built upon unconscious beliefs and behaviors we've built up over many years. So we don't really even become aware of how we're behaving unless we reflect and pause or other people point it out to us. And therefore, the importance of behavior assessment in personal development is all about us understanding more about how we tend to behave in the moment when we're triggered by certain things and whether those behaviors are appropriate in different environments. So all behavior assessment is, it can form one of two ways. One is actually in an individual conducting a survey or an assessment, which we'll go into in a few moments about where they are, about understanding generally how they behave in life and just becoming aware of that. And that's a personal diagnostic, a personal assessment, which we can then work on from there. The second way we can work on personal behavior assessment is by getting a 360 degree or feedback from other people who actually are telling us how we behave in their presence. Both are valid, both really give great insight. But if we have that insight, it means we can make choices about whether we need to change our behavior.
Whether we need to change our behavior. Do people really change their behavior as such?
I think it's really interesting. I think, again, if we were left to habits and working in our unconscious way, we wouldn't. But if we are aware that changing behavior makes our relationships more effective, us being more effective in the workplace, then it's worth us considering whether we need to change them. Now, that might be a very simple change, for example, rather than just doing all the time from task to task, which is a behavior. We can decide to maybe change our behavior to put a pause in between tasks and just reflect on what it is we're doing in that moment. And that's a very simple example which can improve the way we show up in our work and family. So it's up to us. Do we want to change behaviors or not? If we're not aware in the first place how we're behaving, then we can't choose whether to decide whether we change those or not.
I think I really liked when you said, Andrew, that, whether you change or not, but it's always good to give a pause.
Yeah.
That changes a lot of stuff in life, actually. All right, so moving on, you told, there are two ways, basically. So are there some kind of tools or frameworks that are basically used, to assess behavior or in behavior assessment in self-coaching?
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about 4 or 5 so that people can go and look them up and decide what's best for them. The first one to talk about is, I said earlier, a 360 degree. And you can do that yourself very easily by just putting down a series of questions that you want to understand about your behavior. So it might be, how do I communicate? How do I keep time? How do I actually manage my relationship? and just send that out to 10 people in your own network to get the answers to those questions. And you'll get some feedback on how you behave. So that's a very basic, simple element that people can do themselves. And there's tools online, again, you can go and do that to get them a hold of easily. The others are self-assessment tools where we're actually answering questions which are put to us either online or on a piece of paper, where we answer the questions and then get a feedback report after that, which gives us indications about how we might be behaving. The most common one, which we've talked about in a previous episode, is called Insights. It's also called DISC, DISC. I'll go into what that means in a moment, where you get a series of questions asking you about how you tend to behave in certain situations. So people can look that up. You can get free versions of this. That's a very basic one, and we'll talk about the outputs of that in a moment. The second one that people can do, which they've probably learned about, which is very useful for how you behave in teams, is called Belbin, which gives you certain types of behavior types in teams. And again, you can do that online for free, so you can have a look at that. The third one, which people may be aware of, is called Myers-Briggs, which gives you personality types of certain behaviors, which again, you can find online, Myers-Briggs. And then the final one, which is a really useful one, which I use a lot with my clients, is one called the GC index. And that focuses very much more on energy, how we show up in terms of our natural energies for doing things and the way we behave. So there's lots of tools out, many more like Hogan and so many others. But if you just type into Google assessments for behavioral types, then you'll be able to see the ones that are there. But I think the one I want to focus on later on is DISC, which is the Insights tool, so that people can at least understand one tool they might be able to use from today's podcast.
It's like DISC.
Yeah.
And I really like, Andrew, whenever you mention, oh, it's a free tool.
Yeah.
So I think whenever people listen to this word, they're like, okay, let's Google it first and let's just try it for ourselves. Awesome. So how would you describe DISC? Like, can we dive into this tool as of now?
Yeah, let's do that. So you can get access to this tool for free, and they give you a very basic report. If you want more in depth, there's a small cost to that, but that's your choice then whether you want to do that. But the best way to understand this is that when we're behaving as individuals, both at home and at work, we're behaving in relation to tasks that we do and also people that we're in relationship with. And they're the only two dimensions that we're ever behaving into. So what DISC does is allows us to split those out into 4 elements. The first is D, which stands for dominance. I'm just going to go through a little bit about what this manifests as. If you are tending to be high in dominance in the way you're behaving, you will know because you tend to be the center of attention and you tend to be an individual where people will allow you to talk and you'll tend to dominate situations and you'll tend to talk a lot. And there's nothing wrong with that, by the way. It's just a style of behaving. And for a leader, sometimes that works very effectively in terms of being authoritative in an environment. If you have a lower type of behavior in D, it's not bad or good. It just means you tend to sit back a bit more. You tend to take in what's going on. You don't need to be the loudest person in the room, and you tend to be listening and watching for when you can contribute. So the D element of the DISC model gives you an idea about how dominant you tend to be in people's companies. That's relation to people. And again, the actual feedback that you get for your profile would give you a sense of this. The second element is I, which stands for influence. This is all about relationships with people. So if I tend to have a high element of I for influence, it means that I really gain energy from being with people, from being in relationship with people, from having those chats around the cooler about their day and their families, and I get lots of energy from that. If I have a low behavior type in I, it means I will be in relationships with people, but it's only because I have to get a job done. I don't gain energy from it. So a natural, you would know this from people you've behaved with in the past. There are many managers and leaders out there who come and ask you, how's your day and how you're doing? But you know they're doing it almost having to try to do it. It doesn't feel genuine. It doesn't feel authentic. They're doing it because they know they should, but actually they're not really interested in your responses. That's a low I because we're not really interested in that kind of energy. So again, high I, low I, we just need to understand where we are, where we tend to be in behaviors. So that's in relationship to influence. The third element is S, which stands for steadiness. So this is very important when we're part of a team. How reliable am I? How steady am I? How much do I actually deliver against what I say I'm going to deliver? If I do all of those things, I tend to be a high S. If I'm a lower S in terms of behavior, I tend to flip from thing to thing. I tend to be like a butterfly. I tend to start things and then not finish things. And I tend to feel less compelled to actually be operating in a team environment. I can be operating much more on my own. So again, understanding where you are in terms of the S element is important. And then the final one, which is C, is compliance. And this is all about following the rules. So if I'm a high C, it tends to mean I like following rules. I like to have structure to follow. I like to have systems that provide me the input about what I need to do next. And if I'm a lower C, it means I like breaking the rules. I like reinventing rules. I like actually bending rules. I don't like conforming to rules. And so again, it's not good or bad. It's just understanding what your natural behavior type is in relation to compliance. And when we have a good assessment of all those four elements of dominance, influence, steadiness, and compliance, we get a really good indication about how we're showing up in relationships and how aware we might be of those things. And it might be that 90% of the time, the way you behave in work and at home is fine in relation to those behaviors, but there's bound to be 10% where it's not very helpful.
So it's dominance, it's influence, it's steadiness, and it's compliance. DISC. And when I was listening to you, I was just trying to figure out where do I fit in. And believe it or not, I really liked when you said that it's not a good or a bad thing. It's just who you are, what your personality is, and how you behave. So it's nothing about being, if even if you're on the dominating higher scale of being, on the D or the dominance or the influence side, it's not a bad thing.
I agree. I agree. It's just being aware that that's who we are. And there's certain situations, certain times in a day, certain times in a situation where we need to be aware we might need to change those behaviors for a few moments.
That is so beautiful. I think now I can really correlate. That's why you said you need to pause.
Yes.
Beautiful. All right, so let's move on. And okay, so Andrew, can you just help us about some of the common misconceptions? What people really have about behavior analysis in self coaching. When somebody else does it for you, it's pretty simple because they're judging you. You could give an explanation, but if you're doing it to yourself, how is it different?
Well, I think the first thing we need to say is it's just an assessment and it depends how you're feeling on that day. So the first thing to say is when we get these assessments and it's us that are deciding the answers, we need to be kind to ourselves. So it's not saying, as you said before, about good or bad. It's just raising awareness. So it's about the kindness, being empathetic to ourselves and saying, this is a snapshot of how I feel right now about the way I behave. I'm recognizing that most of the time that's going to be good. Okay. So that's the first misconception. It's not a hard and fast thing. It's not to actually manage our performance in any way or be negative. It's about just giving us insight. The second is this does change over time. So just because we do the assessment today doesn't mean it's always going to be like that. If we don't start to put effort into changing our behaviors through training, coaching, or mentoring, it's probably likely to stay the same unless our environment changes. But if we actually put effort into learning about ourselves, gaining coaching, gaining mentoring, over time, our personality assessment behaviors will change. So again, that's something we can put effort into. Really interestingly, there are only 3 occasions where the behavior assessments will change without you doing anything. The first is if you actually go through a very, very difficult situation personally. That might be a divorce from a loved one, it might be loss of a loved one through a bereavement, or it might be severe illness. If those things happen, it tends to give us a reset as a person, as a human being, where we tend to reflect on what our lives are like at that point. And our assessments can change in that moment without us actually doing anything ourselves. So that's the first thing. The second thing is when the environment around us changes significantly. So that might be a change in our boss. It might be a change in our environment in the work structure. So if there's a significant change there, it can lead to a change in our behaviors without us doing anything. And then the third element is where we do have something happening to us which is outside of our control around a person or an individual in relationship to us. And that might be somebody that's being authoritative, somebody that's being subservient. And again, our behaviors can change without us really doing anything. So apart from those 3 examples, our behaviors will tend to stay the same unless we invest in ourselves and our own personal development.
So if I may decipher from what you said right now, so it's technically the three things that you just said right now. I could sum it up like it is like relationship,
Yeah,
it's the surrounding,
yeah,
and it's probably the health.
correct. Absolutely.
And I think these things are very important in life. The most important things in life, the people whom we live with or work with, our surrounding, our locations, and of course our health. Well, so moving on, how would you describe, like, do you feel that self coaching really helps individuals analyze their behaviors effectively? They could be biased, they could be unbiased. So, you really feel that they're able to self analyze themselves effectively?
I do. So the three elements here. So the first is what we've already talked about. Let's do some self-analysis on how I might be behaving. And that gives us some insight about when it's helpful and when it's not. The second part is to actually then be a bit brave and be courageous, particularly in our close relationships, so people we trust, to maybe ask them, does this make sense to you? Do I behave in this way? When do I behave in this way? When I do behave in this way, how does it affect our relationship? And just get some feedback, again, in a very soft way, just to get some insight. Because they may say, I don't really see that really. Or sometimes I'll say, yeah, that's you. Definitely, you do behave in that way. And then just understand if that's the feedback you're getting, is it helpful or unhelpful in terms of your relationship? And if it's helpful, carry on doing it. But if it's unhelpful and it keeps getting in the way of relationships, that's when we can start to decide, do I need to change my behavior? How would it help me? So that's the second element. And then the third element then is about over the long term, if I've got a goal that I'm working towards, which is either personal or professional, what is it about the insight I've gained about myself and from others about what needs to change in my behavior? That might be the way I come across when I'm presenting to groups of people. It might be the way I actually show up when I'm actually giving people tasks to do. It might be the way I am when I'm actually being working towards a goal where all of my team needs to work towards it together and I'm maybe too far ahead of them. I need to slow down. So all of these things are important when you're working towards a goal. But if you're happy with who you are and the way you behave for the insight you gained, then you don't need to change anything. It's absolutely fine. And again, you have that choice. So self-coaching is all about being aware, recognizing when it's helpful, recognizing when it's not, and then making inroads to changing those with the support from other people to start changing those behaviors. But as we've discussed in previous episodes, it's usually quite difficult to do that.
It is pretty difficult. There's something that always, cricket or probably strike my mind is I really wanted to really understand from you because you coach a lot of people, leaders around the globe. We all have a personal life and a professional life. Do you feel that people genuinely behave differently when they appear in public, what they are to with respect to their personal life? Or do you think it's because of the certain kind of, I would say designation or the qualities or probably the kind of titles they carry along with themselves that it changes them the moment they see the public around them?
It's a really good question. I would say most of us behave differently in the workplace and the home place. And I'm not saying that's good or bad, but what I've seen is that the most successful leaders that I've come across are the ones that are probably more close to being the same in work and at home. So they actually don't change who they are. And of course, the thing that changes why we are different in public and in private is the relationships that we're in. So we are triggered by certain people to behave in certain ways. And if we are in a work context where we have more authority and sometimes more power to be able to behave in a certain way, that's different to when we're in a peer-to-peer relationship with a partner at home and we complement each other. So that's what I've seen. It's worth sharing this example. I remember working with a chief financial officer once who, when I said to them, who are you in relationship, both at home and at work? She told me that she was probably 15 different people in relationships, both at home and at work. She had to put on a pretense to be different people depending on who she was with. Now, if you imagine that, which is what she was doing, that's exhausting
It's
because, first of
true.
all, you're having to remember who you are. Then you're having to
True.
put a different hat on, if you like, as opposed to just being yourself. So, in summary, my experience is the most successful leaders out there are the ones that are the most truest, both in work and at home. But for most of us, we are different in home and work contexts.
And maybe those are the leaders that people can genuinely connect with and become popular also.
Yeah,
during their walk of life.
absolutely.
All right, so moving on, whenever you talk about triggers, so do you feel that, individuals like us, common people, we can really recognize these kind of triggers and alter our self behaviors?
Yes, it's great. So Triggers is lovely. There's a great book, which I'll recommend now, by Marshall Goldsmith, who's a very experienced coach. He's in his 70s now. If you look Marshall Goldsmith up, he's now put a lot of information out there for free. And he wrote a book called Triggers. So I definitely recommend people to read it. And there are two types of trigger that change our behavior without us thinking about it. The first is an environmental trigger. So that's something that's external to us. That's usually other people or events. So I'll give you an example. It might be that because of something that's happened to me in the past, if I'm in a crowded place and that makes me feel uncomfortable, then it's going to trigger a behavior in me which makes me a bit more alert, a bit more insular, and more aware because of what's happened to me in the past. That's an external trigger. Something's happened to me. An internal trigger is where the environment just stays the same, but actually it's something within me that I'm either thinking or somebody has said to me that makes me behave in a different way. So an example might be, um, I'm now thinking about tomorrow. I've got a big presentation. I'm thinking about the fact I'm not going to do it very well. And therefore, my trigger starts to change the behavior in me of feeling anxious. So, in both of those situations, whether they're external or internal, the way we can tell it's a trigger is by the way we start feeling. And usually, the feeling that comes up for us is anxiety in some form.
Right.
Now, that manifests in different ways for people. In some ways, it's fear. Some ways, it's just a feeling of butterflies in the stomach or the chest. Sometimes it's increased heart rate. So we know that we've been triggered by bodily changes that happen to us and feelings that are coming up for us. Once we recognize that we've been triggered, we can then understand that, as you said really importantly before, put space in. So reflect for a moment, I've been triggered. And then at that point, decide whether we want to go into our behavior that we normally exhibit when we're triggered, which is unconscious behavior, or change our behavior to be different in that moment in relation to that trigger. And that's what Marshall Goldsmith talks about in his book. And we can all practice it every single day. So we've got to connect with what we're feeling. And as soon as we feel negative or anxious, we know there's a trigger in play.
That's commendable to really know about it. But it's such an amazing thing that, no matter what triggers you, your body is the first one to let you know about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And interestingly, and this is aimed at leaders out there, many leaders have almost learned how to disconnect themselves from their body to stay in their head, to be very rational, particularly in the West. You see this a lot. And they are proud about that because it allows them, from their perspective, to make rational decisions. Now, of course, we know all human beings are irrational. And the reason we're irrational is because we go with our feelings and our emotions. So a lot of work within CEOs around self-coaching or coaching is actually getting them to reconnect with their body and their feelings so they actually go with more their intuition, their gut feeling, as opposed to what their head is saying. So going with the heart and the gut rather than the head.
Going with the heart, certainly. So, Andres, could you just share some very happy story about somebody who really successfully, was able to assess their behavior with the help of self-coaching?
Sure. So this is a chief executive who, when they did their DISC profile, which we relate to, they were very high on the D, so very dominant. They were very high on the I, so very charismatic, love being around people. And we've all met those kinds of chief executives in the past and leaders, but they were very low on the S and very low on the C. So what that meant in terms of the behavior every single day as a chief executive, even though we're very successful, was that people felt as though they couldn't speak in their company. They couldn't feel as though they needed to change rules. And so they were acting in team meetings as not giving space to people. So when we actually provided this feedback through the DISC analysis to this individual, they recognized that to be more successful in the future, they needed to step back from certain things themselves and create space for other people in the team to become slightly more dominant. So what they did, which is a very simple example, is every single meeting that they'd been in the past, they always chaired. They chaired the meeting, they set the agenda, they set the time, they set the decisions, they summarized at the end, and they made one simple change, which is very difficult for them to do. They decided to rotate the chair of the meeting each month that they met so that it wasn't the chief executive anymore. So it might have been the sales director chaired the meeting and they led it in their way. They were slightly less D, less dominant. And it was very hard for the chief executives to sit back and be less dominant, but they were changing their behaviors, creating the space. and letting the sales lead to actually then lead the meeting as they wanted to. So that was one thing they did. They lowered the D element and then created space. And the second thing they did, because they were lower on S and low on C, was they actually got the team to hold them to account more readily about their deliverables. So if you remember, low S was about not necessarily delivering on time. It was about starting lots of things, not finishing things. So he actually put an accountability framework in where the team held that person to account in terms of delivering on time, being on time for meetings. And again, that called for a change of behavior because it was letting go of control. So this individual, after 6 months of trying to change the behaviors, and it takes about 6 months generally to change behaviors properly, so it's habitual, was much more able to engage with the team and to flex their D and S more readily, even though 80-90% of the time they were still being their normal D and S because that's what it required being the chief executive. So that's one good example where they became aware, they decided to change the behaviors, got the support from the team, and it actually led to a more high performance team.
That is a wonderful thing to really know about, and especially for CEOs to give up their particular position in a certain meeting. That was a wonderful step. But as you said, it just takes a moment of pause. It just a
Yeah.
pause that can change a lot of things in life. So, our lovely listeners and all those people who are watching to us right now, just take a pause. Take a deep breath. Things will really change and change for better. So, Andrew, thank you so much for being on this show today. And trust me, you're really inspiration today to so many people who are listening to you and watching to you. And it's very speedy recovery. And I'm very healthy and wealthy 2025 to you.
Thanks, Sandy.
Thank you so much and keep on listening and watching to TAL Radio.